Welcome to the Trinity Channel. I'm your host, Nahren and Anweya. It's so great to be here live at the Trinity Channel, and I have wonderful guests here with us discussing some issues that we're experiencing with religious fanatics of Islam and other crisis issues that we're facing with the Syrian refugees and just other minorities and different refugees that are crossing the borders. And I'm also happy to have Dianna here with us, and just a little biography on Dianna Newman. Dr. Dianna holds a bachelor's with a double major in psychology and sociology from the University of Toronto, and a master's from Southern Evangelical Seminary in apologetics and philosophy. Dianna's passion is to help equip college and university students defend their faith while on the secular campus or in the marketplace. And as a member team, she travels both nationally and internationally to speak at universities, churches, women's conferences, and community events. Dianna is a member of the speaking team for the International Society of Women in Apologetics. Thank you so much, Dianna, for being here with us.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you, Nahren.
Wonderful. And also, we have another wonderful guest here with us on air on Skype, Dr. Richard Shumack. He's a research fellow at the Center of Public Christianity and the director of the Center for the Study of Islam and Other Faiths at Melbourne School of Theology. Years of inner-city ministry with Muslims have led to teaching in universities and schools around Australia. Richard is part of the Understanding and Answering Islam team at Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, and his publications include The Philosophical Apologetic, The Wisdom of Islam, and The Foolishness of Christianity. He loves eating curry, loves and hates golf, and plays Australian football with his boys. Thank you so much, Dr. Shumack, for being with us here today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. And I just recently came back from Australia. I love Australia. It was absolutely beautiful.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, we love living here as well.
Wonderful. And today's topic is the Muslim myth, Islam taught philosophy to the West. So we have many different important points to discuss just to spread awareness to the audience, to have them more informed on this issue, since we are having a large amount of different Muslim communities that are coming through the borders and that are actually will be migrating to our country and many other countries in the West. And also, you know, there are very important things that we should know as citizens of this country to know how to answer back to them. If your children are being persuaded to be forcefully converted, or more like brainwashed to be converted, you'll know different things to do to discuss this, with the other people that try to convert you. But just to start off, let's start off with some questions. Dr. Shumack, Muslims claim that Islam has a fantastic philosophical tradition. Does it?
Well, it's certainly true that Muslims make that claim. Muhammad, in the Quran it says Muhammad told the Muslims that they were the best of all people, and Muslims tend to believe that they are and were the best of all people. And they like to make very strong claims about their intellectual superiority, particularly when they talk about the period early after Muhammad, when the Muslim empire was at its strongest, and they point to universities and mathematics and medicine and many advances that were being made, and therefore they say that's proof that Islam is the superior religion because we were intellectually superior. That's the claim they make.
Wow. And today they say that Islam that taught philosophy to the West, and that they actually taught philosophy to the West. I don't understand how that actually is. I mean, is there any truth to that claim that they taught something that influential to our country and to other countries in the West?
Well, like most untruths, there's a slight amount of truth to it. So it's certainly true that in the early days of the Muslim Empire, there were strong universities in the Arab world. There were universities in Damascus, there were universities in Baghdad. But the interesting thing about these universities was that they were not Muslim universities, or at least they weren't Islamic. There were Muslims in them, but there were Christians in them. And actually, it was Christian Arabs who translated the Greek philosophy into Arabic. And it was actually the Christians who taught the Muslims philosophy. So that's one interesting thing. The other thing, too, is that what happened in those universities was that over time, Muslims who were reading philosophy, and not just philosophy, a whole range of different things that Greeks thought about, they were trying to harmonize that with Islam, and after a few hundred years they realized they couldn't do it, and so they shut it down and they stopped teaching philosophy, and they stopped teaching philosophy maybe 800 or 900 years ago. So it's not at all true that Islam loved philosophy and embraced philosophy and then taught philosophy to the West. It is true, though, that they translated philosophy, and certainly they helped keep some of those texts alive. And in the West, that was a great thing for us, because universities in the West interacted with universities in the Muslim world. But it's not true that Islam taught philosophy to the West.
Dr. Shumack, if I could ask you about some specific philosophers, I think these are the ones that you are probably referring to, but if you could kind of speak to this a little bit more for our viewers. When it comes to Al-Ghazali, a lot of times Muslims will refer to Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Averroes as if they had unique thoughts. Can you speak a little bit more about their contribution? Because of course they were Muslim philosophers, that's not to be denied, but what was their contribution, if any?
Right, we need to acknowledge that there were some very, very great Muslim thinkers in that classical period. Ibn Sina, or in the West they called him Avicenna, was one, and Al-Ghazali was another, and Averroes or Ibn Rushd was another one. One of the interesting things about these, although they called themselves Muslims, Ibn Sina, for example, what he did was he was reading Greek philosophy and he was trying to reconcile it with Islam. But if you read Ibn Sina, it's Greek philosophy. It's not Muslim. It's not Islamic. And so then you had Ghazali coming a bit later, and Ghazali, who I think is probably the greatest Muslim thinker in many ways, he started to realize, we've got problems here. This Greek way of thinking doesn't fit with Islam at all. And so he wrote a very famous document which was called The Refutation, or the Incoherence of the Philosophers. He was saying this stuff does not make sense because it doesn't accord with Islam. And he was the one who really shut down the teaching of philosophy. Ibn Rushd tried to argue with Ghazali a bit later on, but he lost the battle as well. He tried to resurrect philosophy, but then he was shut down again by the religious authorities. They were the people who were trying to stop it.
And does that have any connection to Sufism?
Sufism?
Yes.
Well, Sufism is the sort of mystical, the mystical practices within Islam. There are Muslims who, because Islam tends to be very impersonal, it's just about keeping the rules, that's how you please God. There are Muslims who long for a personal connection with God or a personal experience of God. That's Sufism. And certainly Ghazali, he abandoned philosophy, and one of the things that Ghazali turned to was Sufism. But in the end, he came back from Sufism and became a fairly orthodox believer towards the end of his life. So Ghazali, the fact that Ghazali at least toyed with Sufism gives Sufism some credibility in the eyes of many Muslims. But at the end of the day, Ghazali was very orthodox in his Islam.
And Dr. Shumack, if Islam is so positive about philosophy, then why aren't there any philosophy departments in the Arab world, like any outside international universities?
No, right. That's absolutely true that if you go to the Middle East, you'll find there are American universities, or there are French universities, there are international, well, even Australian universities have campuses in the Middle East, and they will have philosophy departments. But historically, the Arab world has had no philosophy departments, nowhere where they're thinking big questions about comparative religion, or about ethics, about how we know the things that we know. They just have historically not done this. So it is, like you say, it's very interesting. When Muslims say we taught philosophy of the West, you can ask a Muslim, well then, why did you stop doing it? Why isn't there any philosophy? The other thing you can ask them is, what is one significant philosophical idea that Islam has taught the West? And Muslims won't have any answer to that because they don't do philosophy. They have this pride, but it's pride in an imagined history. It's not pride in reality.
And I know that we're focusing on philosophy tonight, but would the same be true for the claim that Islam brought science, math? I've even heard them claiming the arts as if it was invented within Islam. Would that be true as well? The narrative itself is not grounded in any fact?
Well, there's probably more truth to the idea that Islam made great advances in mathematics. But again, it's not Islam per se. It's just at that time, the universities were part of the Muslim Empire, and they were patronized by the caliphs, by the emperors in Islam. But an interesting part of that is that most of the great thinkers were not Arabs, they were Persians, and they were Muslim by name. It wasn't that they were great Islamic thinkers, it's just they were great thinkers who happened to be Muslim, and again, they were mainly Persian, they weren't Arabs. So it's certainly true that there were great mathematics departments and great medical advances were made as well, but I don't think it's at all true to say that that was because of Islam. And in the same way as philosophy, it was like these investigations and the scholarship that was happening in universities in the Muslim part of the world, but that was quite separate from the traditional Orthodox Islam, which resisted many academic pursuits.
Absolutely. And actually, I had given a speech at University of Michigan, a pretty reputable university in Michigan. And the professor that had introduced me, half of the audience seemed to be Arabs, and a majority of them were Muslim, and the rest were Christians and just other religions. And he brought me on as an activist, and just to discuss the crisis in the Middle East and what's happening to the Syrian Christians and other minorities. And the way he introduced me was, and he was an Arab Muslim, and he said, you know, she's an Assyrian, and, you know, these are the people who introduced mathematics, science, the cradlers of civilization. They introduced it to the Arab world. Even simple things like, I mean, simple at the time when they were newly invented didn't seem so big, but the wheel, 360-degree circle, Celsius, Fahrenheit, the first library, and he just went on, and I was like, wow, I'm so impressed that he's aware of our history. And actually, most of the discoveries or the cradling of civilization wasn't even in Iran. It was in Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Babylon. So, and when they had invaded into that area of Assyria and, you know, took over, along with the Persians as well, that's when we introduced all of these things that we had already discovered. And so then we, you know, for a while, and this is actually not just Islam, this is before they had, like you said, converted to Islam, BC. So even then we were introducing things to them. And for a while, you know, I mean, they still persecuted us to a pretty high degree, but, you know, and then when Islam came about, then it just became much worse, radical Islam, of course. But yeah, many things were discovered right there in Mesopotamia, and then it was passed on when the Arabs were coming in from all different corners and decided to settle in those areas. And, you know, they were definitely open to adapting to science and math and, you know, learning different literature from the first libraries that were being invented, and, you know, the first engineering, the first laws, and different things. And then unfortunately, since radical Islam formed, they have been going pretty backwards in their discoveries. I mean, I feel like the entire Middle East is on a stand. It's not really going forward. It's not really improving, technology-wise. It's like we're going backwards another 500 more years. But definitely, I wanted to bring that up. I thought it was pretty interesting that he introduced me that way. He was a Shia Muslim, pretty moderate Muslim in quotes, but it was definitely neat to be acknowledged, especially when there was a genocide happening in the Middle East. What do you think about that, Dr. Shumack?
You're absolutely right. As I was saying before, certainly there were some very clever Muslims around, and the universities were doing some good work. But as you say, it wasn't Islam that was the origin of that work. They inherited scholarship from around them, and they, from, as you say, the Ashuri, or from the Christian Arabs, from Egypt. And some people did some good work, but it's ridiculous to say that Islam itself was the origin of this knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is the Islamic view of knowledge? How does it prevent Muslims looking critically at the Quran and the life of Muhammad? What are your thoughts, Dr. Shumack?
Yeah, right. And this is a really interesting question. It gives you a bit of an insight into maybe why Muslims don't ask very many critical questions about their own faith. Is that traditionally, at least, Islam talks about two different sorts of knowledge. So there's revelation, or the knowledge that is received through revelation from God, and then there is human knowledge. Revelation is primarily it's the Quran and the example of Muhammad. And human knowledge are things like scientific investigation. And in Islam, what you're not allowed to do is ask any questions of religious knowledge. So you can't question revelation, you just have to accept it. You can't critique it, you can't critique the texts, you can't evaluate the ethics, you just have to accept it and you have to receive it. Whereas in human investigation, engineering perhaps, or looking at the human body and doing medical research, that's okay to ask questions there, but you don't ask any questions about Muhammad, you don't ask any questions about the Quran. In fact, there's a saying in Islam that kafirs ask questions. Kafirs, in terms of unbelievers, are the ones who question, and that's talking about they question revelation. So you have these two tiers, if you like, of knowledge in Islam. Revelation you can't question, and then scientific investigation when you can ask questions. This is why, by the way, they could do some good maths, but when it came to philosophy, they shut it all down because it was asking very uncomfortable questions.
That's interesting to me. Aren't the hadith necessary to understand the Quran, which insinuates that they were asking questions about the Quran, and if they weren't asking questions, then there would have been no need to have the hadith?
Right. Well, I'm not saying the system works completely or makes sense. And certainly, even with the hadith, Muslims talk about hadith science, which is the science of working out the reliability of the hadith. So we'll trust this one's very strong, this one's not so strong. So it's not that there's no investigation at all, but certainly when it comes to the Quran, the hadith might give you context for the Quran, or the hadith might explain chronologically where things fit with the Quran. But in terms of whether or not the Quran is the word of God, in terms of whether or not Muhammad is a prophet, those sort of deeper questions, you're not allowed to investigate those sort of questions.
Also, I don't know how you both feel about discussing just Wahhabism and like the roots of Wahhabism, and how it's really being campaigned by Saudi Arabia. What is really the roots of Wahhabism? What is the fundamental idea of it?
Dianna, do you want to have a go at that one? I can say something, but you can have a go first.
You go ahead, Dr. Shumack.
Okay, sure. Well, I was on the program yesterday. We were talking about Muslim philosophy, Muslim theology, and how there's not really a lot of theology in the way that Christians talk about it, but there are different schools of law, different schools of jurisprudence within Islam. And so historically, within Sunni Islam, there are four main schools: the Hanbali, Hanafi, so on, Shafi. And those schools are, there's a spectrum of how conservative they are or how strict they are. And so Wahhabi is a school of thought, and there was a scholar, or at least a sheikh, a leader, al-Wahhab, who was a scholar who had a particular school of thought that was within the strict school, but then he was an even stricter jurist within that strict school. So he had a very, very strict way of interpreting the Sharia. He became very influential because when Saudi Arabia was set up as a nation, he was the influential clergy, if you like, not the correct term, but he was the influential clergy who was connected with the royal family. And so because of his connections, he became very powerful, and because of that power, he became the influential school of thought in Saudi Arabia. So it was a mixture of a very conservative theological position being supported by the royal family. So it gave him political power as well.
Wow. So currently, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, being a United States ally, is highly funding and supporting Wahhabism. I'm definitely hearing more and more about it. It's really scary. I believe a lot of Americans, they really don't even know much about Islam, and then they're hearing about Wahhabism. Just living in Michigan, we have a pretty large Muslim population, and I believe about 40% of them are Sunni Muslim, and quite a few of those are Wahhabi believers, and they're getting supported straight from Saudi Arabia, and they're sending all sorts of different pamphlets, and they're teaching it, and it's really scary that it's spreading so rapidly and it's growing, especially when it's a belief on a very fast pace. Everything, just knowing, I don't have too much knowledge about Wahhabism, just from face-to-face encounters with Wahhabism and just our people dealing with it, but it's radical Islam on a whole nother level, and I really believe that Americans and just the Western world should truly do more research on what's coming through our borders and what's happening to our countries. Just going to a restaurant the other day, and I saw a man with a long beard and the whole entire outfit, and multiple women, and I asked another colleague of mine, and I said, what do you think he exactly is? He's like, well, just physically looking at him and just the area we were at, he was a Wahhabi sitting right there in our restaurant, and he was kind of giving us strange looks too, but it's so scary to think that it's right here, and these are the same people who are supporting Sunni radicals like ISIS right here in our state. How do you feel about that, Dianna? Doesn't that kind of frighten you a little bit, that it's right here in our backyards?
It's definitely frightening. Dr. Warner was speaking about this a little bit the previous show and even yesterday. There's an element of political correctness in this country that's really amputating our ability to talk about these things. And I don't think it's intentional. I think, of course, all of these things are very much systematic. But the inability to talk about these things shuts down the discussion. And, you saw what you saw yesterday, and without making too many assumptions, I think that it's a valid discussion to have here on American soil, because as we've seen in other countries, when certain ideologies come over to the West, they do have sometimes damaging consequences, as all ideas do have consequences.
Absolutely. And Dr. Shumack, what is the exact information you know about, and also Dianna, if you want to answer to this too, about the different types of teaching strategies they're using? So I'm hearing from different teachers that sometimes students on their breaks, they'll have little earpieces and they're constant listening to some sort of audio of Islam. And, and this is happening in as early as grade school. Their parents teach them that at a certain times they have to listen to this, and they almost become zombies. So a lot of teachers have told me, like, I'm really worried. And, they have little breaks here and there, and they know, it's like they're trained. They have to listen to them at certain times, and, they can't pull it from them. They can't really see what they're listening to, because they're very good about what times they're listening to it so that it's acceptable by the school. And, just in high schools, sometimes they put in their earpieces even during class, and they say that this is our prayer time and you can't disturb in these private schools. And it's like they're learning their religion in a way where it's almost, why does it need to be taught even while you're in school? And there are things that some students have done, like literally during class when they're discussing American history, they refuse to learn anything about it. And schools can't even really do anything about it. They're just sitting there and they accept it. And actually another friend in the community had discussed something that happened at another international school, that they kept stealing the Israeli flag and taking the Israeli flag sometime in the middle of the night, and they would hide it, and the only flag that would be missing would be sometimes the American flag or the Israeli flag. And they knew who was really doing it, but they couldn't accuse them. And these things are happening right here on our soil. I mean, things like this never happened in the past. I had never heard of stories like this happening, but it's almost that maybe they're increasing in such drastic numbers in the last 10 years, the population of Islam, and then the increasing number of radical Islam right here in the United States, even in your country, in Australia, the United Kingdom, France. I mean, France doesn't even look like a Christian nation anymore. It really looks like a Muslim nation. I mean, how do you both feel about these rapidly increasing populations and their education system they already have?
Well, I can't speak to America, but I can talk about Australia. And it's true that the Muslim population here is growing, not as fast perhaps as in some parts of the world. And I do think that actually the majority, maybe 80%, I think is the latest research, maybe 80% are not conservative. But you're right, the 20% that are conservative, or maybe the 10 to 15 who are very conservative and who buy into a more an Islamist type ideology like Wahhabism, like the stuff that drives IS and drives Al-Qaeda, and there's certainly a large number of people who buy into that. Their attitude to the local law is that Islam comes first, local law comes second. So whatever the local law says about schooling, or whatever the local law says about flags, or whatever the local law says about anything comes second to what the Sharia says, and they're happy to try and enforce the Sharia on people. And so yeah, that's their mindset. They don't have any intention of trying to assimilate or to buy in. The goal of Islamism is to create a Muslim state, and they'll be doing it whether they're in America or in Australia or in France. So that's the goal of Islamism. It's an ideological goal, and it's naive not to recognize that.
And aren't their parents concerned that they're lacking education because they're so concerned about learning more about radical Islam or Islam in general, and they're so focused on it that they're actually missing all this education that they're supposed to have, that they're supposed to be focused on? And they're supposed to, pray in their homes, or when they do go to their mosque instead, it's like they're so loyal to their prayers. I mean, as long as they're praying to God, but who knows what's happening in between times with this radicalism.
Right. For an Islamist Muslim, for a strict Wahhabi, remember before I talked about the two sorts of knowledge. You have revelation knowledge and then you have human knowledge. They will say the revelation knowledge is far more important than the human knowledge. And so what you learn at school is far less important than what you learn at the mosque. Or perhaps in Australia, it's not the mosques where you're getting that teaching. It's more the Muslim centres. There are da'wah or evangelistic centres, and there's the internet, and there are international, like those transnational movements who are using the internet to communicate. That's where they're getting their material from. But yeah, there are many Muslim parents who are concerned, but the people who are buying in, for them, Islamic knowledge is far more important than the knowledge you're going to learn at school.
Thank you so much. And we're going to take a short break, but thank you so much. We have Dr. Shumack and Dianna Newman here with us in the studio. And please call us 248-416-1300.
Coming soon, the 5th International Apologetics Week, starting November 9th, 2015. We'll broadcast through internet, satellites, and through antenna network televisions. 3 shows per day, over 40 world-renowned apologists. Titles of the shows: The Deity of Christ, Biblical Doctrine, World Religions and Heresies, Science and Creation, Politics, Atheism, Islam, and more. 5th International Apologetics Week, starting November 9th. 3 shows per day. Where? TrinityChannel.com. Click and watch live. For more information, call the numbers on the screen.
ABN and Trinity Channel invites you to watch a special live debate. Ijazi Ahmed versus Dr. Tony Costa. The topic will be, was Jesus the Son of God or only the prophet of God? The debate will be held October 9th, 2015, 7 p.m. Eastern, 12 a.m. Greenwich, and 9 a.m. Australian. Watch us live on ABN and Trinity Channel, or visit our websites trinitychannel.com and abnsat.com. Or for more information, call us at one of the numbers on your screen.
ABN and Trinity Channel launching to Europe and the Middle East on Hot Bird Satellite. You can watch us on the frequency 12111 vertical. For more information, please call us at 248-416-1300. In France, please dial 977-199-168. In the United Kingdom, please dial 122-829-2332. Or visit us at trinitychannel.com or abnsat.com for more details.
Watch ABN on your TV. With the Chromecast stick, you can simply connect your phone to the television to watch shows. Download the ABN Sat app and click on the Chromecast button. Need help installing? Contact us at 248-416-1300.
Welcome back to the Trinity Channel. It is great to be here this evening, and we are live. Please call us 248-416-1300. We have 2 wonderful guests here, Dr. Shumack in Australia and Dianna Newman here locally in the studio. But we are just discussing the philosophy of Islam and, you know, some topics of Wahhabism and just some local things that are happening in our countries outside of the Middle East that we should be concerned about just as citizens, not even just as Christians, but as citizens of your country, what you should know about radical Islam, and especially how it's coming in great numbers now. And, you know, there's all sorts of future migrations that are going to be occurring as announced by different administrations of different countries. But I wanted to discuss how just being a woman, how radical Islam has tremendously affected women in the Middle East. Just looking at different pictures of how women were in the past. I mean, just going back to the Mesopotamian times, you know, in the Assyrian Empire, I mean, some of the first leaders were women. One of the most powerful queens, it was actually a queen. One of the most powerful royalty was a queen, I'm sorry. But so just going from that to now a woman can barely show her eyes in some countries. I mean, it is so sad that I'm too afraid to travel to the Middle East. I mean, especially in our native areas, just because as a woman you are at the highest risk. And, you know, there were different political leaders that had made announcements such as, this is the best time for women to be born. I mean, last time I checked, women were being beheaded in the Middle East publicly, and even it's done in countries like Saudi Arabia, or women are oppressed in countries even like Turkey, or, you know, they're in prison for the wrong reasons. Once they're accused of something, they really don't have anyone to defend them. All they need is one witness to say that they were guilty, and that's it. They'll be stoned to death. They'll be crucified, they'll be beheaded, they'll be raped by over 50 men and then executed. I mean, this is horrible. How can they justify doing things like this, Dr. Shumack? What is your take on their ideas? How can they justify it? Even as a human, do they have any morality in them?
Well, I hope so. But certainly when you look at the way that, taking IS as an example, when you see the way that they treat people, yeah, you wonder where their humanity has gone to, where they can get to that point when they buy into a political ideology that dehumanizes them to the point where they will treat all people, but especially women, in the way that they treat them. And Muslims don't like to hear this, they don't like to think much about it, but there is something in the DNA of Islam, and there's something in the example of how Muhammad treated women, and it was a sort of a two-tiered thing. He would honor women in his family, but if you were a woman who had been beaten, if you were a conquered person by the army, then you were open game. You could be treated however you wanted to. It was like a slave. You could be a sex slave. You could be a house slave. That's how Muhammad treated people. And so that's why Muslims today who buy into that sort of Islamism, that's why they treat people like that. But you're right, it's a dehumanizing way of treating people, because I think at its heart, that's what Islamism, the very strict sort of Wahhabi Islam, that's what it does. It dehumanizes people because it's just this vicious ideology.
You know, I said earlier that ideas have consequences, and you know, this is one of the greatest distinctions between Christianity and Islam. It comes down to the view of the value of human nature. You know, in philosophical terms, we would say that Islam enshrines a very functional view of what it means to be a good woman. What it means to be a good woman is to serve different functions. And in the absence of serving those functions, then she has no use and may, I dare say, no value. That's in Islam. But of course, as Christians, we are not functionalists. We are essentialists, and we ascribe human value on the basis of who we are as human beings. And so, Nahren, all of these ideas have consequences. What we're seeing today, I think a really good argument can be made good argument can be made that what we're seeing today is the outgrowth of a certain philosophical position on value.
Yeah, I agree with you. And part of that too is of the theology of humanity. And so in Christianity, humans are built relationally, and particularly they're built relationally with God. We're built to be children of God. Whereas in Islam, people are built as slaves. That's literally what the main word means. Islam doesn't mean peace like Muslims say, but it means it's peace, if you like, by submitting before God as one of his slaves. And so in Islam, if all humans are slaves, that is a radically devalued position compared to being a child of God, being in effect princes and princesses.
And you know, I think sometimes Christians perhaps too, but Muslims overlook the relevance of certain passages that we find in the Bible. Of course, there's this idea that the Quran corrects for the mistakes, quote unquote, of the Bible. But certainly when it comes to this issue, the creation account is tantamount in this issue. It's in the biblical creation account that we get the value of what it means to be human. The text says that God created male and female in his image and in his likeness, and he told them to rule and to reign and to have dominion, and we know how that goes. That account is absent in the Quran. And because it's absent in the Quran, there's nothing in Quranic teaching that bestows value. And so we overlook these passages of scripture. We think that these are just stories that don't have any entailments. But the creation account is tantamount. And the fact that it isn't in the Quran says much.
Absolutely. Very well said,
Yeah.
Dianna. And also, Dr. Shumack, so I've been hearing a lot of just, reading different messages from radicals, and a lot of them make statements such as Shia Muslims aren't real Muslims, so that's why they're going after them and they're executing them in the same way that they would actually distinguish a kafar. So why is it that people like ISIS, who are Sunni Muslims, who claim they're actually the real Muslims, why do they label Shia Muslims as fake Muslims?
Well, it's hard for me to put myself in the place of a jihadist Salafi, like an ISIS person, and work out exactly what they're thinking. But I think all of us Christians that will have the same tendency at times too to think that our form of the faith is the pure form of the faith. And certainly in Islam, that's each of the different, any Muslim I run into, they believe that their Islam is pure Islam and that the other people's Islam is not pure Islam. The difference, I think, with ISIS or with Salafi jihadism, the very strict form of Islam, is that if you are allowed to enforce your faith with violence, whether it's military violence, whether it's the police, whether it's random acts of terrorism, whatever your theology tells you can do, if you can then within your theology decide that someone's not a Muslim, then you can go at them with violence. That's a significant difference, I think.
Absolutely. Also, another question. Muslims have a saying, kafars ask questions. Why does Islam resist asking tough questions about life and faith? Why do you think? If you want to take that,
Dianna?
Dr. Shumack. Or,
Sure.
or Dianna.
If I might reference the Quran, Surah 5, 101 says, "O you who have believed, do not ask about things which, if they are shown to you, will distress you. But if you ask about them while the Quran is being revealed, they'll be shown to you. Allah has pardoned that which is past. Allah is forgiving and forbearing." It seems to me that certainly in this ayat, it's essentially saying, don't ask questions, don't ask things which, if they're shown to you, will distress you. But part of the act of learning and part of the act of acquiring knowledge is to ask questions, and sometimes the asking can be quite distressing, but that's the only way that one gets to truth. Distress is not an indication of some mental distress, at any rate, is not an indication that we should resist asking these sorts of questions. And so I think, Nahren, that sort of mentality is sourced in the Quran.
Right, and linked to that is the idea, and the Quran is riddled with this all the way through, is the idea that doubt leads to disbelief. And so roughly on average, every 7 verses or ayat of the Quran, there's a warning that you'll go to hell through disbelief. And doubt is seen as a downhill slope that leads you to disbelief and then leads you to hell. So doubt is bad, and questioning is doubting, and so questioning is bad. Anything that might lead you to question the truth of Islam is seen as necessarily a bad thing. And so, of course, if someone comes to you and says, how do you know that Muhammad's a prophet? Give me some decent reasons for this. Or how do you know that the Quran really is the word of God? Then they're a dangerous question for a Muslim to look into too closely, because if there is any doubt about that, they're instantly thinking, this is going to take me to hell.
And you know, I think that's in sharp distinction to 1 Peter 3:15. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give an answer to those who ask you the reason for your hope. So in one sense, we have a situation where Allah is, he's, you know, not wanting Muslims to ask questions, but in another sense, we have this idea in the New Testament that we should be able to answer questions and we should be able to defend the things that we believe.
Right, and not only that, doubt is seen as maybe not a good thing, but it's certainly seen as a very human thing, and it's something that God honors and God works with. In the Psalms, you see people yelling at God and questioning God and crying out to God and wondering what on earth is going on. And then when you see Thomas, who's the most famous doubter in the Bible, and Jesus' response to Thomas isn't, well, just believe. His response is he holds out his hands and says, put your fingers in the holes. Here's the evidence, and then believe. Then he calls for the belief.
Right. And you know, Dr. Shumack, I don't see this issue that we're talking about distinct from what I was saying before in terms of functionalism versus essentialism, because if God has created us in his image and in his likeness, then there's something about our rational natures that should be affirmed and not necessarily discredited. I see just in this discussion that we're having right now, this tendency for Islam to not allow people to live out their full humanity, because of course part of what it means to be human is to exercise their rational and intellectual powers.
Yeah, right. I think that's true. Muslims will probably say, well, we can do that in the realm of science or the realm of human knowledge, like I was talking about. But at the end of the day, it's a false distinction, saying that there's some sort of way that we know about God that's different from the way that we know about anything. Now, we know knowledge is just knowledge. We have our faculties and we know things about the world and we know things about God, and we know all those things through the same methods, the same ways. And so it doesn't make any sense for a Muslim to say, well, you can ask these questions, but not these questions.
Right.
So yeah, I agree with you. Islam, at the end of the day, it's saying there's some real no-go areas, and you can be human, but only to this point.
Right, right. And then this would then have implications for the fact that Allah everything that a Muslim does is not necessarily done out of free will, not necessarily done out of choice, but it's because Allah commands it.
Right. Well, certainly from the early days, the issue of free will was a very controversial one in Islam, because one of the great catchphrases of Islam is inshallah, in the will of God. Everything is seen as happening within the will of God. And again, particularly in the strict schools, you have a very strong idea of everything being predetermined. And so in the Middle East, my experience there, you drive around with people, they wear no seatbelts because they think, well, if God wants me to die, a seatbelt's not going to save me. It's all just this very strong sense of everything is in the will of God. And you're right, I do things by command. I don't take much personal responsibility on myself.
Very well said. So I have a question. So, I evaluate a lot of different radical Islamic videos and different speeches. And it almost appears by what they say sometimes that they really feel that we have a different God or we have multiple gods. So they always say we have one God. I mean, do they actually believe that there are different gods? Like Allah translates to God. Do they not know that we believe in the same God? Not the same religions, but there's one God.
Dianna?
Sure. Well, that's an interesting statement. It's one that I hear often. You know, etymologically speaking, God and Allah are the same words, right? So Allah is the Arabic word for God. God is an English word. They're connected that way. Of course, Muslims historically trace back to Abraham, Moses, and the rest. However, I always like to use this analogy. Just because two things have the same name, they don't necessarily mean that the object is the same. And so you, Nahren, may know someone named Sally. I may know someone named Sally, but the Sally that I know is quite different from the Sally that you know. So just with that example, I think it's pretty safe to say that bearing the same name has nothing to do with whether we're talking about the same thing. It's the characters of the individuals that bear the name that ought to be of concern to us. And so when we look at the God of Scriptures and we look at the God of the Quran, they exemplify different characters, even though etymologically they carry the same name. What do you think about that, Dr. Shumack?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Seems to me that Islam has, and you see this historically, it has a strange interplay of, on the one hand, wanting to say we're the same as you, we're legitimate, we stand in the same tradition, we're Abrahamic, we believe in the same God. And then on the other hand, they're wanting to say, oh, by the way, your God is false. Particularly in terms of Trinitarian belief is ridiculously false. But I think the big picture is that when we talk about God, Muslims and Christians are talking about the same being, if you like, in the sense that we're talking about the Creator. We're talking about the Creator who is the judge of the world and the sustainer of the world. But again, as Dianna was saying, the important question for me, and I think to ask a Muslim, if I'm talking with a Muslim, is, okay, we're talking about God, but what's God actually like? What's God's character like? How does God interact with us? Do you think that Christianity or Islam has a better description or a more true description of how God interacts with people in history and in your experience?
Absolutely. Since Muslims have, especially the radical ones, if they have constantly misevaluated their beliefs and their religion, why are they so persistent, and why do they think they are so right?
Yeah, right. Seems to me that, again, particularly about questions to do with the Quran or Muhammad, they're no-go areas, and most of the apologetics that you run into with Muslims today, particularly about proof for the Quran or proof that Muhammad's a prophet, they're reverse engineered in the sense that they work backwards from that belief. They don't start with genuine questions. And so they don't examine that stuff. And it is ironic, I think, that at the same time, nearly all the Muslims I've met have been absolutely, totally certain about those beliefs so for example, the belief that the Quran has never been changed. Every Muslim I've met is absolutely 100% certain on that. None of them have ever really looked at the history or looked at the text that we have in universities or in the libraries, but they're absolutely certain about it. Partly it's to do, again, with it's that knowledge, and they have a traditional view of knowledge, so you trust what the authorities say about it and you just accept it. But they've never really looked into it. So what it means is their confidence it's a psychological confidence, but it's not a confidence that's based in reality. In fact, just to take that example again of the texts, one of the things that's coming out in scholarship at the moment is that that traditional story about the Quran being unchanged, it just can't be true. It doesn't fit with the text we have. It doesn't fit with the history as it's emerging. And interestingly, you're having Muslim scholars starting to recognize that and acknowledge it. Acknowledge that the text that we have in the various museums and in the libraries are full of changes and full of intentional changes. But Muslims don't know about this because they're not allowed to ask those questions.
Very well said. And we are going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Okay.
Good
Coming
job.
soon, the 5th International Apologetics Week, starting November 9th, 2015. Will broadcast through internet, satellites, and through antenna network televisions. 3 shows per day, over 40 world-renowned apologists. Titles of the shows: The Deity of Christ, Biblical Doctrine, World Religions and Heresies, Science and Creation, Politics, Atheism, Islam, and more. 5th International Apologetics Week, starting November 9th. 3 shows per day. Where? TrinityChannel.com. Click and watch live. For more information, call the numbers on the screen.
ABN and Trinity Channel launching to Europe and the Middle East on Hot Bird Satellite. You can watch us on the frequency 12111 vertical. For more information, please call us at 248-416-1300. In France, please dial 977-199-168. In the United Kingdom, please dial 122-829-2332 or visit us at trinitychannel.com or abnsat.com for more details.
ABN is now an app. ABN is now on the iPads and the iPhones. Search for ABN Sat in the App Store. Watch all the channels: Arabic, English, Worship Channel, Surth Channel, Kurdish, and Al Qudus Channel. For more information, call us at 248-416-1300. Visit our websites at abnsat.com or trinitychannel.com.
Do you have a Samsung Smart TV? Would you like to watch the Trinity Channel on your Samsung Smart TV device? We'd like to share with you an easy way to set up the Trinity Channel and view it on any Samsung Smart TV. If you set the home page on your browser to this address shown on the screen, the Trinity Channel will broadcast live upon entering the browser. It takes about 5 seconds to load the website once entering the browser. If you have any questions about setting up the Trinity Channel on your Samsung Smart TV device, please give ABN a call at 248-416-1300 and we'll be happy to help you.
Welcome back to the Trinity Channel. I'm your host, Nahren Anweya, and I'm actually an activist, as you all know, and we have today Dianna Newman with us in the studio, and we still have Dr. Shumack on Skype with us from Australia. And just to go back to the topics we have been discussing about the philosophy of Islam and the different topics of radical Islam, and we also wanted to discuss another subject that came up, Dr. Shumack, but about the errors that you were discussing that are being evaluated in the different scriptures of the Quran. Can you discuss that in more detail about the different errors that we're finding in the Quran?
Right. I don't know whether errors is quite the right way of putting it, but certainly one of the strong claims of Muslims is that the Quran is completely unchanged. Every letter has remained the same. Every version of the Quran is identical, and it was collated under Uthman, who was the third caliph, I think. I'm not good at the history, but he collated the Quran, and it's been unchanged ever since. Problem with that is that it doesn't fit with the text that we're discovering in museums and in libraries. And so you have one of my friends, he was doing research, and what he did was he went all around the world and saw the oldest Quran manuscripts that we had. And he looked through them, and he looked through them looking for not just accidental letters being left out, but deliberate changes, places where things had been rubbed out and other things written over the top, things where there were words that were different from other Qurans. And what he found was that in virtually all the manuscripts, all the early manuscripts of the Quran, there were many, many changes, and many changes on each page. There were hundreds and hundreds of changes. The problem is that Muslims have never looked closely at their texts. Muslims have never done what we as Christians have been doing for hundreds of years, which we call it text criticism. They've never done it. And so they have this false belief that their Quran is this perfectly preserved by God, unchanged document, and it's just not true. It has hundreds and hundreds of changes. And we're also working out that traditional story that under Uthman, under that third caliph, that it was standardized, that can't be true because the texts that we have are different from beyond his time.
Dr. Shumack, isn't it true that the standard Quran that's used by most Muslims today was only it only arrived on the scene in 1924? Is that right?
Oh, slightly out of my area, but yeah, I think that's true. The translation that they, or at least the Arabic text that they're translating from, is fairly recent.
Sure.
But
okay.
That's largely to do with the form of the recitation, I think, rather than the particular words.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, don't quote me on that one. Quran, beyond that sort of early text criticism stuff, the modern stuff's not really my area. But,
okay.
But I think you're right. It's certainly recent. There are many things that Muslims claim that are far more recent than they would like to think.
Right.
Also,
so the idea, yesterday I mentioned the idea that the Bible has been changed. No Muslim said that for hundreds and hundreds of years after Muhammad. It was only hundreds of years later when they finally started to read the Bible that they realized, hang on, this is different from what we expected. And so then they started saying, well, it's been changed.
You know, Dr. Shumack, do those who are Muslim apologists, do they know that these challenges that are put forth, do they know that they're new challenges? Are they aware that for the first several hundreds years of Islam, that no one was saying the sorts of things that are being said today? So for instance, this afternoon we had David Wood and Shabir Ali. They were debating, and much of what Shabir Ali was arguing was a mathematical justification for the truth of the text. But that sort of argument was never put forth in the early years of Islam. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, as I said, Islam has never really had a history of text criticism. So up till now, they've never had to encounter it. And the apologists have just gone on denying that there's been any changes. But that's starting to change very, very recently. So just in the last debates that Shabir Ali, for example, has had in the last year or two, some of this material has been presented to him. There was a debate, I think it was earlier this year, with Nabil Qureshi, and Jay Smith, I think, has had a debate with him as well, where he presented this material and he was caught by surprise by it. So I think Muslim apologists are going to, it's now too late for them to start to continue just to say, no, the Quran's unchanged. They're going to have to confront the reality that actually the Quran has changed and that the traditional story can't be true.
Right.
And Dr. Shumack,
what they do is interesting.
How do you feel about statements that are made by, for example, the moderate Muslims, the ones that are a little more westernized, that have a lot of friends who are Christians? A lot of them have made statements such as, you know, here we are discussing, you know, extremist Muslims and just their idea and how the interpretations that they have of God, you know, they've taken it to a whole nother level of extremism. But how do you feel about statements they make such as the Western countries, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, they have unleashed the radical Islam. So they're pretty much saying indirectly that we almost created it by funding it, by just empowering, for example, countries who believe in Wahhabism. So it's almost that even if we were able to ally with the moderate Muslims in a way where in 200 years they would eventually become so westernized where we wouldn't even think that's an issue anymore. But then here we are facing Islam on a whole nother level that we haven't seen in hundreds of years. And it truly, I mean, I can see their point. I can see the empowerment of radical Islam. A lot of it is coming from the West. For example, like I've said before, Saudi Arabia is an ally of quite a few Western countries, and here they are being one of the most oppressing Islamic countries in the world. I mean, their population alone is over 95, actually more than 95. It's 99.9% Islam and Sunni Islam. And they make a lot of statements like that, and truly, honestly, it's really hard to come back with a statement at them to argue with them because it's true. How do you feel about that?
There are certainly some uncomfortable truths that the West, and I say the West, I'm not talking here about the church, I'm just talking about the West politically, really. There are uncomfortable truths that the shape of the Middle East as it is today was heavily influenced by the West, particularly the British and the French around about 100 years ago when they carved it up and they gave power to certain people. So the power that Saudi Arabia has today is largely because the Saudi royal family allied themselves with the Brits and the French. And it's also true that a lot of the chaos in the Middle East grew out of that period where borders were cut across people groups. And so there is a bit of a sense, I think, in which the West did create a bit of a rod for its own back. But having said all that, that's no excuse for people to play a blame game or a victim game and then say, well, it's all your fault. People in the Middle East have had 100 years to take full responsibility for their own actions, and the ideology that they're buying into is an indefensible ideology, the ideology of oppression and abuse and violence. Whatever injustices people have suffered over generations, there's no excuse for reacting to that by becoming a completely dehumanizing and inhumane oppressive regime, and that's what we're seeing in many places in the Middle East.
Thank you, Dr. Shumack. We're just going to take a quick break here. Please join us back.
ABN and Trinity Channel launching to Europe and the Middle East on Hot Bird Satellite. You can watch us on the frequency 12111 vertical. For more information,
and you can hear it spoken by world-class speakers from around the whole planet, experts on topics such as science, evolution, Big Bang cosmology, creation, Islam, the cults, traditional Christianity, the history of religions. You're not going to hear that other places. There's no other channel you can hear this sort of information. This is desperately needed, good information, true information that you're not going to get elsewhere. I'm here to ask you to prayerfully consider supporting this ministry. You know, whenever it comes time to support.
Watch ABN on your TV. With the Chromecast stick, you can simply connect your phone to the television to watch shows. Download the ABN Sat app and click on the Chromecast button. Need help installing? Contact us at 248-416-1300.
Welcome back to the Trinity Channel. We have Dianna here with us still in the studio, and also Dr. Shumack on Skype, and we'll get right back into it. And please, Dr. Shumack, continue on the topic you were discussing.
Oh, right. Well, we were just talking about moderate Muslims saying that it's sort of the West's fault. And I was saying, yeah, there's some uncomfortable history that we need to recognize, and some uncomfortable alliances, even today, that we have, that are political alliances. But again, there's no excuse for people blaming those sort of things for inhumanity. And here for me is a great contrast. You contrast the way that IS in the Middle East is responding to what they perceive as injustice, and they're responding with, in effect, retaliation and repaying and becoming unjust themselves. Whereas you compare that to somewhere like South Africa, where you have what I would say is a Christian response, which is, how do you deal with injustice? You deal with it with truth and with reconciliation. And at the end of the day, the Christian message is that payback and enforcement and violence, they never solve anything. True solution comes through, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who reconcile. It's a reconciliation with truth and acknowledgement and repentance, but the goal is reconciliation and not dominance.
To follow up on that, Dr. Shumacker, how can Christians best encourage Muslims to question their faith?
Oh, well, I think one of the best ways actually is to be extraordinarily Christian around Muslims. Muslims are taught a whole lot of things about what Christians believe, how Christians behave, and many of them are not true. They believe them because their religious authorities told them. But when a Muslim spends time living life with a Christian, and with a Christian who's being a grace person and being a person who has this intimacy with God, and a person whose prayers are being answered, and a person who responds in Christ-like ways, it challenges their idea that, like I said before, that Muslims are the best of people. It challenges the idea that Islam connects you with God in the best way. Prayer in particular, I find, is an incredible thing. When Muslims over the years have been staggered by the intimacy that Christians have with prayers, and amazed that God would answer their prayers. And so the best way I think to get Muslims questioning is for them to realize that the stuff they've been told about Christianity is just not true, and the way they see that, the way that is cracked open, is by their experience of grace and love coming from Christians around them.
Very well said, and also a very good question, Dianna. But I truly believe that the best way to answer Islam is just to go to church and pray and know your faith as a Christian. But how do you feel about possibly Christians being able to represent themselves better by actually just understanding some of these Christians, just to give you an example, they haven't been to church in like 6 months, a year possibly. In Western society, you're so caught in your work and just going to work every day, and then you're so tired on Saturdays and Sundays that a lot of people are forgetting to go to church. And it's almost that they're Christian by label. How do you feel about just even generally strengthening Christianity and uniting Christianity against radical Islam, or just against evil in general, no matter where it may be and what form they are? That Christians have so many different types of Christianity that, in general, like you and I, we might be different denominations, but we are united under the Christian name. But many Christians, they're so into their own particular denomination that it's almost that's all they consider to be Christian, and that they're so divided. Even in the United States, like there's so many different types of churches, and even throughout the Western world. Do you believe that even Christianity truly needs to be revamped in a way where we have to remember that God did not create these labels, and Jesus didn't create the different types of Christianity that we did as humans, and that we truly need to unite right now? Because the different challenges we will be facing, I don't think we have seen the worst of it yet, and we will see some pretty horrendous things in our future. Just reading the Bible and the different things that are expected to happen. And if you're not prepared, if you're not a strong Christian, that you will fail in every topic and every subject. So how do you feel about just strengthening and uniting Christianity, no matter what type of opposition we may have?
Right. As far as I can see in the Bible, there's only one recorded prayer where Jesus prays for us, as in us being the church right now. And that's in John 17. And he really only prays one thing. He prays that we would be one, and that we would have a unity that was like the unity that he has with his Son and with the Holy Spirit. And that the reason for that is so that people will know that he is real and that the gospel is true. And if we preach a gospel of reconciliation and love, then obviously we need to live that gospel out. And that's Jesus' prayer for us. And I think you're right. That's a powerful testimony. That's the thing that points people to the reality of the gospel. And it doesn't mean we have to do church in the same style and in the same building all the time together. Clearly that's not going to happen. But it is the gospel lived out in the lives of Christians and in the lives of churches that will point Muslims to the reality of God. Absolutely.
We were speaking about this yesterday in some sense, that the thrust of Christianity is to change the human heart. It's not necessarily to do all of these different things or accomplish these different tasks, but in the changing of a heart, then behavior follows.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I truly believe that right now is the best time to do it. All these horrendous things that are happening throughout the Middle East and that are spreading throughout the world, some things that we are seeing that, in my lifetime, I have never seen a genocide happening, and where it truly is a war between good and evil. And I want to look at the rest of my nation and know that I am fighting with strong warriors in this. And the reason why my family originally migrated to the United States is because it was a Christian nation. And we were just discussing this the other day, but it's hard to say that it's a Christian nation anymore, because the reason why we are even questioning that as Christians, as Americans, is because, like we were discussing, they're not so patriotic and about their faith, so that it's almost that, the young kids that are growing up, it's almost like, oh, I don't want to go to church. Like, just parents, we have to have the responsibility to distill that in our children's mind, that it should be their passion. They should, we should educate them with love and, introduce it to them in the best way we can, or even just bring them to church. And, but, like we said, we're just so caught up in, our work and our careers and different things like that. And sometimes we do forget to go to church. And I truly think that should be revamped.
Right, and you talked before about warriors. Yeah, we need warriors, but we need warriors who use spiritual weapons. And Ephesians 6 talks about our spiritual weapons, and they are strong faith and righteousness and a gospel of reconciliation and forgiveness. They're the tools we have. And the irony is that Islam is a religion of power, and it seeks to enforce, but it's top-down power. It's not the inside-out power that Dianna was talking about. And Christians are on about power as well, but it's the power of a transformed life. It's the power of a renewed life. It's the power of forgiveness that restores a relationship. It doesn't crush the enemy. They're the tools we have. They're the weapons that we have. And they're beautiful weapons. And in the mindset of a radical Muslim, they're laughable and they're weak and they're foolish. But again, as 1 Corinthians says, the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men.
Absolutely. Do you feel that, and this question could be to both, do you feel that we have hope to coexist, even if they were the majority one day? Do you feel that we have hope to coexist, even if it were to happen in Australia or possibly the United States?
Well, I don't know whether coexistence is exactly the right goal for Christians, but one of the interesting things is I'll tell two very quick, not stories, but two things about churches that I'm personally connected with. So in Iran, you have a far greater chance, I think, of becoming a Christian in Iran than you do in the US or in Australia. There are people flooding into faith in Iran, and Iran is one of the strictest Muslim countries in the world. Another place where there's a lot of tension between Islam and Christians, and where Islam is seeking to dominate, is in sub-Saharan Africa. One of my students, he's from Ethiopia, and he's from a Muslim background. He was persecuted very heavily. He was the first Christian in his village. He was persecuted heavily. But over time, Muslims started coming to faith. There are now 34,000 Christians who are from a Muslim background in his church, in his denomination. And so, yeah, there's absolutely hope. Islam is not beyond the power of God to transform and to bring life.
It's my personal opinion that if Islam were to get rid of their apostasy laws, we would probably see millions of people converting out of Islam into Christianity. And that's encouraging to me because it says that fear is the number one thing that is preventing people from openly converting. It's not necessarily that they don't have access to the light and to the truth. And so that's why we as Christians need to stay in prayer, that the Lord would continue to work on the hearts, that the Lord would continue to draw them to himself, because that's his job. That's his job.
Right.
Very well said, Dianna. And we truly, truly, as humanity, must come together and just, first let's put God first, that we believe in God. And, if there are any Muslim viewers also watching, that, we all believe in the one God, and to stop the persecutions and unite together as humanity first before we even proceed to the next steps, especially during these times today. And put your morality first, that, before all these were created, you believed in God, and we are all brothers and sisters, and we must truly end these evil doings to any religion, because this is not the way of life. What type of human wants to live their life and just self-destruct and destroy our beautiful earth that God has given us? And I truly hope that we can come together one day and bring God before us and Jesus Christ, our Savior, and come to reality, come back to life, come back to this earth, and become one, and that will truly be heaven. And I just want to thank our wonderful guests today. Dr. Shumack, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Australia. I know that we are on completely different times right now, and you've been great, and we hope to have you on the show again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Love to come back. It's actually lunchtime for me, so it's not at all a burden. It's sunny and it's warm. It's great.
Wonderful. And I'll let you know when I'm in Australia next time.
Please do.
And thank you, Dianna, for also being on the show with us. I hope to have you on again, and you've been great the entire day. And you know, we definitely should come on the shows to discuss this topic some more, and possibly bring you on to some of the other topics I'd love to discuss with you in the future.
Well, it's been great speaking with you, Nahren.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for watching. Again, I'm your host, Nahren Anweya. I'm your Assyrian Christian activist, and I also advocate for the religious minorities and humanity. And also, if you'd like to learn more about the causes that I'm involved in, please visit me on Facebook and Instagram. And thank you for watching Trinity, and also visit the Trinity website and also call for more information. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Good.